Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope you're all doing well. So today we're going to be looking at Lightroom Classic version 11's new masking features, but they're not really that new. A lot of the stuff in this is just a reskinned or a different interface for what was already there. But I've had a lot of questions on how to use it, how to do intersections, all these kind of things, and the reality is it was all there before. There's just a new interface with a couple new features that are helpful. So anyways, what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to try to cover as much as I possibly can about this and everything you could need to know. But I'm going to be using photos from my recent Iceland trip in ways that I've actually edited them, rather than just trying to create examples out of thin air. So with that said, let's jump into some of these photos in Lightroom version 11. All right, so this first photo we're going to be looking at from Iceland needs quite a few masks to help it out. I've already done most of the preliminary edits and all the edits that I'm going to have in the photo. We're just going to add some masks to it, so I'm not going to go through a full breakdown on how I edited this photo. But what I can say is the new masking feature is over here, and you can actually just select it, and then it's going to bring up all of these things, such as select subject, select sky, things you're probably familiar with, which is the brush, linear gradient, and radial gradient, color range, and luminance range. Now, previously, the color range and luminance range used to be tied into the brush, linear, or radial gradient. Now they are their own separate mask, but we'll get into that in a little bit later. So I'm just going to go through this image and show you how I would edit it using these in natural ways. And I think you're going to pick up on a lot of things on how to use the masks in your own photos. So the first thing I want to do that I know this photo needs is the bottom half of the photo definitely needs to be brightened up. So I'm going to select a linear gradient, which is also using the shortcut M, and then I'm just going to drag while holding Shift to keep my horizon line straight. And I'm just going to do this. Now, the first thing that I would change in your settings for me personally is there's two settings that are normally on, which is the automatically toggle overlay. What that's going to do is every time I adjust something and double click it, it's going to keep doing the overlay. The other thing is it's going to be a color overlay like this. And I actually prefer, me personally, to use the image on white. What that's going to do is show me the image that is being basically affected and then fade into white for the parts that are not affected. That is my own personal preference, but what I would do is come in here and change this to how you like it. I highly suggest removing the automatically toggle overlay. For me, that got really annoying because in my workflow, what I'll do is I will bring down exposure, for example, and then I'll double click it to reset it, and then I'll bring it down again, and I hated that it kept showing the overlay over and over again, so I turned that off. The other great shortcut that you're going to use a lot is the O button. That is just going to show your overlay when you want it. So the first thing, like I said, is we want to brighten this bottom half of the image, but not a whole lot. So I'm just going to bring up the exposure a little bit. And I'm going to bring up the shadows a little bit. That's all I really wanted to do. I just really want to be able to see the bottom half of that frame a little bit easier. So the next thing I'm going to do is add a radial gradient. The shortcut for that is Shift M. You can also come up here and go to Create New Mask, Radial Gradient. And what I'm going to want to do here is I kind of want to create like a big source of light where the sun is. So I'm going to have the middle here. And one of the features they added to the radial gradient or gradients in general is that I can actually visually see the feather of the gradient. Many times I use a pretty big feather, usually 100, 90, something along those lines. But now visually being able to see how it feathers is really nice. So for example, I could sit here and drag the feather. I'm going to hit O so you can actually see that. And then you can see where it's affecting the image. Remember, I have it set to show you the image or the parts of the image that are actually being affected. So we're actually going to bring our feather down here. I'm going to turn that overlay off. We're going to drag this down even further. And then what I'm going to do is bring up the exposure a little bit. And the effect that I want here is to kind of just create more brightness from that sun, but on part of the image down below. Now you can already tell that a lot of this image is already affected by the sun. We're just going to add a little bit more. I'm going to bring up the whites a little bit. I'm going to bring up the contrast. And I'm actually going to bring down the highlights because what that's going to do is bring up the exposure and things like the shadows and some of the midtones, but it's going to keep those highlights from clipping as much as possible. I'm actually going to bring down the clarity. And what that's going to do is kind of create a little bit of a glow. I'm also going to bring down the dehaze, again, adding a little bit of glow. And then I'm going to warm up this by a little bit. And the last thing I'm going to do is add a color to it so that these areas that are basically bright white get a little bit of color. And to do that, I'm going to come down here, make a color selection. You want to choose something that makes sense for a sun shot, which would be a warm or a red tone. So I'm actually going to come over here and pick more of a red tone. And then this slider here is going to basically change the saturation of that color. Obviously, we don't want something like this. We want something pretty light. That's about 10%. So I'm going to turn this on and off really quick, and you can kind of see what that's doing. It's adding just a little bit of a red glow, kind of adds a little bit more atmosphere to the image, and I quite like that. So now that I can come up here, I can show you this mask on and off. It's much easier in this interface than it was in the previous interface. It's one of the reasons I like the new masking feature. So we're going to turn that on and off, and you can kind of see how it's affecting these areas down here. Last thing I want to do is bring up the shadows a little bit. I'm going to check where I'm clipping. That's a bit too much. Now, keep in mind that this particular image was already clipped originally, so there's actually no data right here where I'm actually shooting into the sun. So I'm going to bring the exposure down, and we're going to bring the shadows up instead. Bring the exposure up just a little bit. Bring the highlights down. And take a look at our clip. This is fine for now. I think that's looking pretty good. So here's that effect on and off. And you can see that it's adding a bit of glow here. It's adding a little bit here. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I really want to make this piece of ice stand out a little bit more. So I'm going to add another radial gradient. Again, that shortcut is Shift-M. I'm going to come up here. I'm going to kind of make it the shape of the ice. And it can be a little bit smaller. I'm going to bring my feather to 100, so it's basically going to get rid of that. And I'm going to take a look. And again, you can hover over this little dot to see your overlay. You can hover over the radial gradient here, and then you can actually hover over the whole mask depending on how many things you have in that particular mask. And then all I'm going to do is bring up the whites by quite a bit. And what the whites is going to do is it's just going to make these spots that are already kind of shiny, shinier, brighter. And that kind of is just going to add some natural contrast just to that area of the image. So looking pretty good. We're going to bring up the exposure a little bit, but not too much. And we're going to add a little bit of clarity to that piece of ice. And I think this is looking pretty good. The last thing I want to do is darken the whole sky a little bit. To do that, I'm just going to use a gradient. I'm going to press M. That's going to bring up a new gradient mask. I'm going to drag down, and then I only want it to affect the sky. Now you might be asking yourself why I'm not using the create mask for select sky. And that's because the sun is in there, and I don't, for the select mask, it's going to leave out this particular mountain. It's going to leave in the sun, and it tends to look a little bit weird for this particular image. But in another image, I'm going to show you how to use the select sky to a better degree. Also, this is a really easy image to do because a gradient or the horizon line is perfectly straight. There's only this one mountain that I'm not too worried about it being darker. But all I'm going to do is actually just bring down the highlights, and it's not really going to affect that mountain in the first place. And this is just going to add a little bit more to this image. We're actually going to stretch this out a little bit more. And now I can turn this on and off, and you get an idea that it's just adding a little more detail in the sky. We can actually increase the dehaze a little bit and probably bring back the highlights a little bit. And I think this is looking pretty good. So you can come in here and turn off any of your masks. That's one of the best features, is you get an idea of what masks you already have in an image. And this is really helpful when you've edited a photo and maybe you come back a year later, or I don't know, a few days later, and you have forgotten what you've done to the photo. This happens a lot for me, and I think it's really beneficial to have this interface. All right, so in this next photo, we're going to be taking a look at just the sky selection feature, which I think is probably the newest feature of the masking tools in Lightroom version 11. There's also a select subject, but that doesn't get used very much in landscape photography, and in my experience of using it so far, it has not gotten the subject pretty often. So I'm hoping that they improve that in time. The select sky feature is actually pretty great so far, but I don't use it in every photo, just like the one we just looked at. A lot of the times, it really depends on the photo, and a linear gradient will do what I want in a more natural way. On this particular photo, though, the select sky feature was great. Oh, pardon the interruption, but I just wanted to say that this video is actually sponsored by me. You can check out my 2022 calendar, which is linked down below. It's got these cool little QR codes for some of the images where you can see how I took the images in the field. And honestly, it just really helps support me make these videos. Anyways, let's jump back into Lightroom masking. So I don't want to darken my mountains in the background here any more than they already are. And if I use a linear gradient, even bringing down the highlights, it tends to affect those mountains. So if I just open up my masking panel here and go to select sky, it's going to automatically do that. And then I'm going to hit O for you to be able to see. And again, everything that you can see is what it's selecting. There's a little bit of a halo here, but that's okay. That's going to give us hopefully a nice fall off to those mountains. And then all I'm going to do is bring down the highlights. And it's going to do a really good job at just selecting the sky. And what's really important here is that when you do select sky, you need to make sure you can come in and it's not creating some kind of line or halo from your, whatever your range is, whether it be mountains or foliage. A lot of the times foliage is going to be much harder. This mountain range was pretty easy and it hasn't done any of that. So if I go in here and turn my mask on and off, it does a really good job blending those two layers together. And I think it looks absolutely spectacular just doing the sky selection for this. Something else you can do the sky selection for that's pretty great is in this particular photo, I've got a lot of brightness in the photo, but I can't see anything in the foreground. And I do artistically want to leave that foreground dark, but I still want to be able to see some detail. So again, we're going to come over here to the select sky feature. It's going to select the sky like this. And then all I'm going to do is hit invert. And now my selection is just the non-sky parts of the image. And I have a lot more control. So this is a section where using the linear gradient wouldn't work, right? So if I tried to use the linear gradient, which again, shortcut is M, and try to just affect the bottom half of the image, I would have to do this, and then I would have to add a Luminance Mask, but then it might pick up parts of this part of the sky because it's also dark, and it just wouldn't work that well. So I think particularly here, the sky mask works really well. So I can bring up the shadows if I wanted to, and I can bring up the exposure just a little bit, and I can reduce the noise in just that part of the image. And look at that, it's still dark, but I now have some detail for that part of the image just using the sky selection. And the last thing that you always want to check when you use a mask like this is just how well it does in the transition between the sky and whatever is on your horizon. And in my opinion, this looks pretty good. It doesn't look like it is creating any halos. We can actually zoom in even more here. And it doesn't, I don't see anything that's causing me to think that I, manipulated this in a very stretched out way and made it look almost too fake, or it has artifacts, or it's got a little halo in it. That's important for you when you use the sky selection mask. All right, so in this next photo, we're going to be taking a look at the luminance and color range masks, which already existed in the previous version of Lightroom. They were just bundled into the other gradients, such as radial and linear gradient. Now they are their own mask, and you have to add linear or radial gradients if you only want to affect a certain area, which I'm going to show you how to do. But the first thing we're going to take a look at is this black and white photo. Now, I did say the color range mask, which we are going to use for this photo. So let me start off by saying that this is what the color version of the image looks like. So little tip for if you're ever doing some black and white editing is you can actually manipulate the white balance to make it either more blue or warm, depending on what colors you want to adjust in your HSL for black and white. And I'm going to show you how this is going to affect the image later. Just remember that the sky is pretty blue. Remember that. So let's convert it to black and white, and let's go into our mask panel here. So the first thing I want to show you is that, actually, before we take a look at that, let me show you what happens if I decrease the blue saturation in my HSL here for black and white. You're going to notice that the bottom half of the image here is going to get darker and look mushy. I don't want that, but I like the way it's affecting the sky. So let's reset this. Let's bring the blue back down to about -5. And then we're going to open our mask up, and we're going to do a color range mask, even though we're in a black and white image. So I'm going to do the color range mask, and then immediately when I click that, it's going to bring up a color selector, and I'm going to select somewhere up here in the sky. That's going to select the blue part of the sky. Now, you can see this is the overlay for it. It's affecting most of the sky, but also some parts of the image that are blue in the water. So the next thing I want to do is I want to create an intersection. You can do that in two ways. You can hold Alt on your keyboard, and this little intersect will show up, or you can click these dots and go to intersect mask width. I'm going to use Alt on my keyboard, select intersect, and I'm going to do a linear gradient. And then I'm just going to drag the linear gradient to where I only want it to affect the sky. So when I hover over the linear gradient, it's going to show me what the linear gradient is affecting. When I hover over my color range mask, it's going to show me what my color range mask is affecting. But then when I hover over my mask that is selected up here, or just hit O, you're going to see what's going to happen, which is this linear gradient and this color range mask are working together, and I'm only selecting the top half of the image. Now, this is the exact same as it was in the previous version of Lightroom when you used a linear gradient and then added a color range mask to it, which if you want more detail on that, I have a great video here that goes into how to use it in a really creative way on this tree of a picture I took in Utah last year, I think. Anyways, so now that I have that selection, let's get back here, remove our overlay, and then all I'm going to do is bring down the exposure. So I'm basically creating that same effect in a more natural way. Notice how it's not messing with any of these clouds. It's making that sky nice and dark like I want it in a black and white photo. And I'm using a color range mask in a black and white photo. Okay, hope that makes sense. Now what we're gonna do is I kind of want to brighten up this line that's in the photo here. And I'm basically gonna do it exactly the same way, except we're gonna use a luminance mask. So we're gonna come in here, we're gonna create a new mask. We're gonna go to a luminance range, and we're going to select the white that's right here. And as you can tell, it's gonna select all of the mountain, all of the parts of the clouds, and all of that stuff. But we don't want to affect any of those parts of the image. So again, we're gonna hold Alt, intersect, and we're gonna use a linear gradient again. And then I only want it to affect the bottom half of the image. Then I'm gonna hit O, and now it's only affecting those white parts of the waves that are coming in. And then now what I wanna do is I wanna bring up the whites a lot, and maybe the exposure just a tad, not very much. Again, we're already selecting the whites, so it's gonna just be using the whites anyways. So the one thing I wanna mention about these luminance range masks is that it used to be that you had a slider for the luminance values and then the smoothness of that slider. They've kind of combined that into one slider, which I'm gonna show you really quick. So here's our current selection. This is how it's selected when we use the little dropper tool. But what I'm gonna do is I'm actually just gonna select the whole image. I'm gonna hit O, and you can tell that it's selecting the whole image. And then I'm gonna bring this down here, and that's gonna basically tell you what the luminance values are. So if I take my overlay off, what you're gonna notice is there's this really terrible grain between the two because all it's doing is just cutting right off at that luminance value. But usually what we wanna do is feather that part of the image. So now that we have our selection, I can drag this part and it's just gonna create a feather. You can watch it on the screen as it's feathering to that part of the image. And I think this looks pretty good. So just play around with that a little bit. You can also use the Show Luminance Map, which is basically gonna do the same thing as the overlay, but it's specifically in the luminance range menu. So anyways, let's take that overlay off. Let's make sure this looks pretty good. We're gonna turn our mask on and off. So the next thing is you're gonna notice is we're actually gonna bring the brightness up even more. I don't want this part of the mask to be this bright. So those mountains that are reflecting there, I don't want them to be as bright as this part of the line here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna come into my mask here and I'm actually gonna go to subtract. And in that, I'm going to subtract a brush. And all that's gonna do is subtract whatever I end up painting in with the brush. So I'm gonna come over here, make sure my feather is at 100. I'm gonna make my brush a little bit smaller using the bracket keys that are next to the letter P. And I'm just going to paint in right here so that it's not affecting the brightness parts of this image here. I'm gonna have to get in here a little bit more selective. I'm gonna come in here. I'm going to go to erase, move the feather. I'm gonna hit O so you can see that mask and see how my brush has now affected that part of the white. I'm just gonna paint this back in a little bit like that. And what's nice is I can hover over the brush. I can see what I've painted in. I can hover over the linear gradient and see how that's affecting the image. And then I can hover over the whole mask to see how it's affecting the image. So we can turn this on and off, and you can see it's really only affecting the waves on the ocean, which is what I wanted. So kind of went over color range masks, we went over luminance masks, and we went over just having masks in general and how to manipulate those with intersections, subtracting, or adding. You can also add parts to a mask. So if I wanted to add a radial gradient, I could. So for example, if I wanted to make, for some reason, this part of the image brighter, I could do that. I don't want to do that, but I could. So the next thing I'm going to go over really quick is I'm actually just going to use this image as an example. I'm not going to go through and create every mask in the image. Again, I'm just going to show you how I use them. So let's go mask by mask. So this first mask, if I turn it on and off, basically just brighten the bottom half of the image like we've already done in some of our other images. And again, it's really nice to just be able to open that mask panel and see what I've already done to the image. This one is going to darken the highlights in the image and bring down the exposure just a little bit, again, just using a linear gradient. The next mask was very specific in what I wanted to do, which was just add some clarity back into the shadow detail of the image, because what I ended up doing is I wanted this image to have an overall soft feel with all of the ethereal parts of the image, with the way the sun is shining through those clouds and how it's all affecting the parts of the highlights of the image. But what ended up happening once I removed some of that sharpness is that the clarity in the shadows of the image just got too dull. So what I did is I came in here and I created a luminance range mask for just the darker parts of the image. You can see my luminance range here. And then all I did was bring up the clarity to kind of bring some detail back into that part of the image. And last but not least, again, I wanted to soften up those highlights. So what I did is I brought a luminance range, I selected the highlights, and then all I've done is brought down the clarity for that part of the image. And that's created this nice little bit of softness in the light. It's very hard to see, but it is there when I'm turning it on and off. All right, so that should pretty much be everything you could possibly want to know about Lightroom Classic's new masking features in version 11. I hope along the way you also picked up on some editing techniques, saw how those masks can bring an image to life, and just different creative ways you can use things like color and luminance range. Anyways, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, you can like it. If you loved it, consider subscribing, and I'll see you again on the next one. Later.